Hey, Mwiya.
Hello.
Thank you very much, Mwiya, for coming on the show today. Really excited to speak with you. I think it's awesome what you're working on, and I'm just looking forward to talking through all of it. So first and foremost, you are the co-founder of Frontier Capital Partners, co-founder and CEO of Thebe Investment Management, Zambian private investment firm, and notably you're developing Nkwashi, which is a new city privately built in Zambia. That and a bunch more. You're working on a ton of projects, which I look forward to discussing here today. But first and foremost, would love to hear kind of your background from growing up in Zambia all the way through deciding to start on these ventures.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I guess speaking to your question, yeah, I was born in Zambia, principally raised here, spent 2 years in Swaziland also, and I went to university in the UK. So, my upbringing was fairly normal. My mom was a farmer, my father is an economist. And so I guess by global standards, it was a fairly sort of like middle income experience. But for Zambia, because it's a very different context, it was I guess a somewhat sort of like privileged experience. So I went to school here for both my primary school and my secondary school, and then studied finance for my BA, and then did a master's in international business. Principally focused around VC and private equity. Then I basically worked in the UK for another year, found this startup. We raised some angel money, about 30K. Unfortunately, the project that we had founded didn't pan out the way we wanted to. We weren't able to raise any more follow-on capital. So we had to sort of like shutter that project. And then I came back to Zambia. I started working here as an analyst, did that for 2 years, and then founded Thebe, which is building in Nkwashi. So whilst as an analyst, I largely covered real estate and local equities, with some sort of like other asset classes in between those two, like fixed income, for example. So it was a very generalist role, but it gave me a really good sort of like high level bird's eye view understanding of what was happening in Zambia, what the trends were in real estate, what the demographic issues were, and where the opportunities sat. And so I used a lot of that learning to then inform a lot of what we're doing now, around the idea of sort of building a new city.
So you mentioned the way that you grew up was relatively fortunate given where you grew up, but in a normal, in like a normal United States city or something like that would be considered more of a middle income situation. Um, Having been fortunate in your upbringing and being able to go and get your education in the UK and work for a year out there, a lot of people, and I'm kind of making an assumption here, you tell me, but people from Africa generally or Zambia specifically, and the types of people you grew up with who might have been a little bit more fortunate locally, may have been tempted to kind of leave Africa, leave Zambia, and take advantage of these opportunities abroad and kind of never look back or only go back to visit and things like that. You've taken kind of the polar opposite view where you came back to Zambia, and not only that, but your entire life's mission is basically to build Africa back up and gain parity with the rest of the world and really advance the culture and society within Africa. What do you think drove you to care so deeply about Africa and come back to help advance it as a society?
So I think a lot of it has to do with my upbringing. And so being an economist's kid, you sort of grow up around conversations that relate to your country's economy and the rest of Africa's economy and all the potential that exists here, and everything that could potentially be done to improve things. And you also get exposed to all of the frustrations regarding why things don't work. So, I constantly be hearing these conversations between my dad and his friends, who are also largely economists. And, it sort of like informed a lot of how I saw the world. And on the flip side, with my mom being a farmer, whilst, we weren't very affluent by Zambian or even international standards, we're pretty well off. So she ran a pretty successful commercial dairy and poultry farm. And so, at some point, both her and my dad started exploring ways that could use the surplus earnings from their farming venture. So, like, I guess, expand their balance sheet. And so they started acquiring land. And so the land that Nkwashi now sits on was the consequence of that farming venture. So it was originally purposed to be a ranch. So they already had a dairy operation, and they wanted to add to that a beef ranching operation, and also a coffee plantation. So they could sort of like manage their, I guess, the currency portfolio within the context of generating the USD from coffee, which is a cash crop, which is sold internationally. Whereas everything else that we're doing in the ag space was completely focused on sort of servicing local demand for food. And so, I grew up seeing them do all these things. And so at the back of my mind, in as much as I went to the UK, I also entertained the idea of staying there permanently. But, I also felt very much like the competitive advantages I had didn't really translate in the UK, in the sense that I didn't have any assets there, right? And so, whereas in Zambia, there was some assets that existed that I could hopefully come back to and help expand further. And I didn't know exactly what that looked like at the time, but I knew I wanted to be involved in that story. So I guess that's what informed my decision to come back. Also, does the fact that the startup that I had started didn't play out the way I expected. So had we actually succeeded in building a startup, there's a good chance that I might not have come back. But it was this, I guess, duality between those two experiences. Like I want to be doing this cool tech stuff that I was involved in. At the time, I was like 2021. But on the back end, there's also like this I guess, responsibility I knew I had.
That's a great explanation. It makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of times with really successful people, you see how early failures kind of drove them to what ultimately, the area that they ultimately succeeded in. And I'm not sure, and you could talk about it a little bit if you'd like. I'm not sure the startup you were working on in the UK, but I somewhat doubt it was ambitious as what you're doing now in Zambia and in Africa at large. And I could see that failure with the startup pushing you to come back home and take advantage of the assets that you had, and namely the land, and have this master plan that you're working on now. Certainly seems like it was worthwhile, and hopefully you'll be able to reflect on it that way. Is that kind of the way that you think about it now already?
Yeah, I think that's, um, you know, everything that a person goes through in their life can either sort of like break them, or alternatively help inform how they make decisions thereafter, in a very positive way. And so I chose the latter, though it was painful at the time. I chose to just reset and reflect. And so, that's still the same ethos I have today. So, mistakes will be made, but you just have to use those as moments to reflect.
So let's talk about what has driven you to the mission that you're on now, and seemingly for the rest of your life. You had these assets from the farming business that you mentioned, and this land that could be utilized in potentially another way. And you also saw the population growth forecasted in Africa, Zambia specifically, but Africa at large, where right now I believe Africa has about 1.4 billion people, and that's projected to double to about 3 billion by 2050, and then double again potentially by the end of the century. My understanding is that you kind of saw this and figured, very reasonably that there's going to need to be a lot of cities built. Africa is already kind of behind on having enough cities and employment within those cities to give people, um, good living and good employment. And so you wanted to kind of step in and make a difference in that future. Um, I read your master plan, which is brilliant and really inspiring. Would you care to kind of walk people through how you think about this master plan?
Yeah, so I think you've spoken to, I guess, the high level trends which inform it. Yes. So there's a lot of population growth that's happening. And there's already a lot of population growth that's been happening. So Zambia, as an example, where I'm from, had a population of give or take 3 million people in 1964 when it got its independence from the UK, and it's now almost 20 million people. So that's massive amounts of population growth, and that's happened in a context where you also had AIDS. You've had pretty low health standards and quality throughout that period. And yes, things have been improving. The AIDS issue is significantly less of a problem today than it was, say, 30 years ago. But the fact that those things didn't materially derail the population growth, I think, says a lot about the amount of inertia behind these trends. And so the thing is, to the extent that these trends play out and economic growth doesn't grow at a disproportionately higher level, what we'll end up with is a lot of people sharing poverty, right? And that's not good for geopolitical stability. It's not good for health and education outcomes or human development outcomes. It's not good for the rest of the world because Africa will be almost 40% of the global population. And so the question is, how do you participate in the enhancement of African society so that we can avoid all these sort of like adverse outcomes that come from like mediocre economic growth? And you can either just like go long on traditional institutions and sort of like, I guess, norms, or you could say, well, those are all great and good, and we support all of that, but the private sector needs to take on a significantly stronger role in helping shape the future. And that's the view, me and colleagues have taken, which is that we need to be much more invested in shaping the type of outcome that we want. And so we think building new cities is a good way to do that because it provides for all the sort of like hard infrastructure that people need. So people need homes, people need streets, people need infrastructure, people also need social institutions like affordable schools, they need affordable healthcare. And so we're thinking a lot about these issues. And so as an example, we recently launched Explorer School, which is an online-only school, which is full-time, from grades 1 through to 12. And it's an international school standard curricula that we're teaching off. We have just a little under 100 students in that. So it's growing at an okay pace, but the cost per student that we're charging parents is something like $25 a month through to about $50 a month, which is significantly cheaper than the next alternative that would have, which would, at least private alternative, which would cost almost 3 times more for significantly lower quality. So that's an example of us saying, okay, what's the closest to near free education that we could provide our residents that pretty much all of them can afford. And so we're building all these social institutions and these physical goods, physical public goods as well, as a means of trying to address these broader problems. And then ultimately, what we'd like to do is actually just build a completely new sort of like labor market and financial system that is much more open and globalized than what we currently have, so we can get a lot more people employed locally, but working for global employers, or enable global capital to invest in local startups, and then enable local startups to export their goods or services to the rest of the world, so that these cities aren't completely dependent on their host country's economic well-being. They can be economies unto themselves, which we hope then becomes a flywheel that enables these private cities to just keep growing and being more effective at enabling economic growth.
So I definitely want to talk more about Explorer School and Nkwashi, the city that you're building. But the way that you've kind of set this up, my understanding is that there's kind of a larger vision, and the backbone to that vision is this new economic model almost. And I believe you're calling that Taji. Is that correct?
Yep.
So I read the black paper on Taji. Super interesting. Awesome people involved at both writing the paper and the advisors. Could you talk a bit? I'd like to kind of start with Taji, if it makes sense, and then get into how Nkwashi is the first city to kind of show a proof of concept for this model, and then how like Explorer School is building kind of the educational backbone and kind of starting from 10,000 feet out and zooming in to how you're beginning to actually build the infrastructure.
Yeah. So one of the things that has been very apparent to us over the last several years is that building a new city is difficult for a lot of reasons, but principally because it's expensive. And so we built a model for Nkwashi, which is largely self-funding. So people sort of like pay us for the residential lots on amortized plans, and we use those cash flows to just build out the city. But not everybody's in that position. And in order for us to achieve our vision, we need way more cities being developed across Africa by way more people. And that means we need to solve the financing problem both for them as well as for their city residents, both individuals and businesses. So people need to have access to capital. And so the existing financial system in Zambia or across much of Africa doesn't really allow for that, because you've got 54 small countries, each with their own little economic systems, right? And whilst you can sort of like put the Francophone Africa, particularly in West Africa, as you could consider it a single economy because they all use the same currency. There'll be nuances in regulation and all sorts of things across these different countries which act as friction points. And so what we're trying to do is, to the furthest extent possible, sort of like eliminate those friction points and enable these cities that could potentially exist across Africa to operate as a single entity. And so we think blockchain is really effective at doing that. So, Ethereum and Bitcoin are all global currencies, right? They're global first. And so we're trying to sort of like use that way of seeing the world to inform what could be done here in Africa to enable new cities to be developed. And so the idea behind Taji is principally to enable new cities and the economic ecosystems within the cities to thrive by allowing people who are surplus holders of capital across the world to finance people who are deficit users of this capital, and therefore allow for capital movement. So people who are building new businesses, people who are building infrastructure, people who are building their homes or buying homes could then issue securities on this blockchain that would enable them to have access to the capital that they need. Further, because they'll be living in and operating in these cities where this currency is sort of accepted by everybody, it means that they could actually accept salaries in this coin. Landlords could accept this coin as payment for rents, or you know, banks would accept this as a as a means of paying for liabilities. And so you sort of actually create a true financial system in that sense.
So would it be fair to say that you're to some degree looking to build this new African economy in the digital world where it'll be a lot less, it'll be a lot harder for countries themselves to interfere with the economic actions of people on this blockchain using this currency. And secondarily, it'll be a lot easier for people to choose to enter this economy of sorts because you don't have to necessarily move anywhere. You could obviously, things might be easier if you move to an Nkwashi, where potentially Taji is a much more accepted currency in the physical world. But if you are, for example, like a software engineer working for a more international company, this enables you to get paid in a currency from wherever you might be in Africa and bring some of that value back to the local economy.
Yeah, that's basically part of the other thinking there. And unlike say uh, several existing blockchain projects, we're not necessarily thinking that this would be a completely market-driven pricing for the currency. So it'd be more of a stable coin than a true cryptocurrency in that sense. And the reason is you need to have a healthy level of stability to enable people to actually trust, you know, that this coin will have the same value today that it had tomorrow when settling those when settling payments for goods and services. If that's not the case, it reduces incentive for people to buy. And so that then also informs a second thing, which is that you need to actually build a real economy in these cities, right? So that your stable coin isn't tethered to just one currency, but rather a basket of currencies, similar to say how the Hong Kong dollar or the Singapore dollar function. Right? So if you're an export-oriented economy, you want to make sure that your currency achieves some level of stability relative to your trade partners, and that also prevents you from creating inflation or deflation in your own market because your currency is, in a very real sense, an expression of your trade relationships, which cities have to by default because you're going to be importing a lot of food and things of that sort from your immediate neighbor, right, which is going to be your host country. But you'll also be selling goods and services to counterparties in other countries within the broader region or the rest of the world. And so you have to achieve a level of stability across all these different stakeholder relationships that you have.
That makes sense. You've mentioned a few times now the importance of having an export-led economy. Can you talk a bit about why that's your view and how Asia, in a way, has led or has demonstrated that model in the way that they've kind of gained parity with the rest of the world in terms of their economy?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the answer lies in your comments at the end there, which is what's the fastest way to develop an economy, right? If your immediate neighbors are largely in the same state as you, i.e., poor, trading with them, whilst beneficial, will have limited potential uplift gains for you. So if you want to maximize the potential upside that you could achieve from trade, you want to make sure that you're trading with people with the greatest amount of disposable income or trade demand for whatever it is that your country is good at doing. And so trading with larger economies, both in the region and across the world, enables that because it facilitates for larger flows of credits. And I think that's been demonstrated with the likes of Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, South Korea, Japan, and many others. It allows that leapfrogging to take place. And so our view is that within the context of building um, this new economy, the fastest way to achieve that accelerated level of economic growth is to really go hard on exporting goods and services which are globally demanded.
So this is a slight change of topic just for a moment. I'd like to, I kind of glossed over when you mentioned uh, how, Taji is in some respects following the example of Bitcoin and Ethereum and focus more so on providing a stable coin. But how have Bitcoin and Ethereum been received thus far in Africa or in Zambia specifically? How have these technologies been used by people or leveraged by people? I know in the States, a lot of people are obviously working on Ethereum applications. Bitcoin is popular to some degree, extremely early still from other people's point of view, and is mostly being treated as kind of a speculative asset that I personally am very bullish on. How do people in Africa engage with these early leading cryptocurrencies?
Um, so from what I've seen in Africa, Bitcoin is still the sort of like, I guess, the market leader. And a lot of the use cases seem to be related to transfers of credits from one location in the world to another. So like really low cost transfers of money from country A to country B, so that various types of, I guess, use cases can be settled. So one is remittances, the other is trade-related settlements. So people who are traders in, say, Nigeria and are importing something from China and don't want to use the banks because it's expensive and slow, will just send Bitcoin to the person on the other side, and then the person will just ship the physical good. So on both sides, they close out the trades into whatever the local currencies are pretty quickly to avoid FX related dislocations relative to what it is that they're trying to commercially do. So a lot of the use of crypto at the moment seems to be that is peer-to-peer movement of money.
That's interesting. In the U.S., a lot of people observe that that's at least as far as I'm familiar, people observe that that's a great use case for it. But in the U.S., there's a lot less need for that. Remittance example, for instance. And so it's interesting to hear that people in Africa are already um, exhibiting this use case. And I think for people in the U.S., people who are less familiar still view Bitcoin as like, they just don't believe it's real. I think fundamentally, and to hear that it's being used very practically in like real economic trade abroad is interesting for me to hear. So going back to Taji, obviously this is an extremely ambitious goal and not one that's out of reach, but one that's going to take a lot of work over a lot of time. And one person can't do it by themselves. So I understand you have a great team that you've built around you and some really notable advisors as well. Would like to take a second to speak about some of those advisors. So I think you have Vitalik Buterin on board, who's been on the podcast previously, Balaji Srinivasan, Joe Lonsdale. How have some of these advisors helped you shape the vision for Taji and your master plan overall?
Yes, so I guess there's a minor correction that Joe's an advisor at Explore Academy and Explore School, but not on Taji. But Vitalik and Balaji are advisors in basically all these different projects. I think, speaking specifically in this instance to Balaji and Vitalik, they've been very helpful in framing these issues within the context of what's practical, right? And how to how to execute. So like, what steps do you take when, and how do you build up a community So these are things that, they've done, in particular that Vitalik has done. And so I think he's able to sort of like relay his experiences, and say, yeah, this worked, this didn't work. In my experience, the best way to tackle this problem is like this. And so that then informs some of the thinking we've had, regarding how to roll this out. And then just more generally, we've been pretty slow, to get this done. And that's largely because, I favor caution. There's a lot that I don't know. There's a lot that needs to be done, before any of this is practically useful for people. And so a big part of making sure things are done well is having the right people involved. And, um, that takes effort, because you have to get to know different sorts of people, involve them in the community building process. And then more generally, there's the more immediate, priorities, like actually building the city. So like taking a very like step-by-step approach to doing this.
So let's talk about Nkwashi now. This is the first city that you are building on, I believe it's 3,000 acres of land from the family's farming business or acquired otherwise. Can you give an introduction to that for people who are totally unfamiliar?
Sure. Over the last several years, I've been working on building Nkwashi. Like you mentioned, it's a 3,100 acre, though strictly speaking, 2,700 acres of that is the development proper. The first phase, which was not part of this, master plan, it's a group of I think 85 acre plots that we used to create the liquidity to then move on and sort of execute this larger project. We are building the city around the idea of it being a knowledge hub, right? So it'll be anchored by a university as well as a talent accelerator and several schools. So the ambition here is to provide reasonably low cost but high quality university education and non-accredited, so like skill building in the talent accelerator that results in people being able to get international jobs through global remote work placement, but stay in the city, living there, working there. And so as you're churning up graduates each year, you're adding to your pool of people who are working in the city, and are earning foreign currency or eventually Taji, and therefore like creating this economic ecosystem there. So that's the long and short of it.
So what drove you to focus on building it as an educational hub? You could have tried to get a large company to build a headquarters there or something like that. Why was the education hub the most attractive way from your perspective to attract people and ultimately a self-fulfilling economy?
Yeah, the reason for that was largely that Nkwashi is a little bit of a distance outside of the capital, so it's a half-hour drive. If you're driving slow, maybe 45 minutes to about 50 minutes. And so it's not really ideal for building out corporate headquarters for people who might have to have a lot of day-to-day interface with their customers in the larger city, Lusaka. And so we had to build out a new economic anchor that wasn't reliant on day-to-day engagement with people who live in the city. And so university is great for that because there's a lot of precedent for it. We know it's something that works, it sort of like becomes an economy unto itself. So you end up with people who service the university. You've got landlords who emerge to service students. You've got staff of the university who end up living there. You've got people who sell goods and services to the staff. So the success of places like Palo Alto, Cambridge, Oxford, Grahamstown in South Africa, and many others, Guildford as well in the UK, um, suggested to us that this is something that is viable. The question is what happens to your graduates, right? So if they're transient in the sense that come and live there for 4 years and then they leave, then you aren't really capturing a lot of the potential upside that could otherwise be created by establishing a sort of like network effect. And so if you are providing means of employment for them, for which there's a lot of demand in Zambia because it's a small economy and it's one where you have a large youth population and a lot of population growth, but not necessarily a lot of new job opportunities being created, then that's a really, really strong competitive advantage. And so that compels people and incentivizes people to want to stick around. And so that was the thinking there is like, if we can create this economic system that's creating these jobs, then long term, that starts to actually build up both population density as well as economic activity.
So I understand you're using ISAs. For those who don't know, those are income share agreements where basically people can have their university experience and education financed by others in a way where they'll pay back those people lending them the money essentially over time as a percentage of their income post graduation. Is this right that that's something that you're using to help people go to university, or something that you plan to use once it's fully built out? And how did you kind of arrive at this model as being one that would work well for you?
Yeah, so it's not something we're doing just yet, but it's something that we would like to do eventually. And the motivation for that is this idea that you want to have the best potential pipeline of students passing through your university, right? And if there are significant binding constraints that prevent the most talented, but sometimes the most underprivileged kids from being able to attend school at your university because they don't have the means, then you want to find ways of limiting those friction points. And ISAs are a great way of doing that because what they do is they enable the potential learner to have access to the thing that they actually need, which is capital. But they also enable investors who want to earn yield to do so by forwarding capital to the student, who then gains access to a high quality education, but then returns that capital with a multiple back to the investors post graduation and gaining employment. So that really enables your demand funnel to expand or be broader, and that's something that's net positive for us. It's also net positive for society in general. But it's another layer of complexity on an already complex project, and so it's not something that we've done, but it's something that's in our radar and that we want to do eventually. But first, we just want to actually launch the university, start enrolling students, and then make that available to people once we've stabilized the university.
So speaking of the launch, where are you guys now in terms of progress on the university specifically? And how does Explorer School and Explorer Academy, how do those fit into the overall education picture within Nkwashi? And then if they have reached more broadly, how does it expect to scale as well?
Yep. So we had hoped to launch the university this year as an online-only experience, but then working with the local regulator, there were a couple other things there were a few things that we had to conclude with them before we could do so. So the intention is to launch next year as online only initially. And we've also started working on the university campus, so we're building out the physical infrastructure to support the university at Nkwashi. And we're hoping that we can have this initial phase done within 18 months of start, which was last month. So we're looking at sometime in early 2022. And so we could actually have physical school happening at Nkwashi, sort of pandemic allowing, alongside the online experience. So we've already built the e-learning platform. We launched Explorer Academy and Explorer School for which we've had students already. So like, again, taking this bite-sized approach and sometimes facing delays.
So beyond the education piece, which is obviously important and central to the thesis around building Nkwashi successfully, what else is in store for Nkwashi in terms of your plan, and what else has been done thus far in terms of progress? I know you mentioned it's slow and methodical, but would love to hear the vision. I know there's a couple of lakes and plans for abundant places to go shopping and obviously residential areas. I would love to hear kind of the overall view.
Yeah, so we finished a dam, we finished a park, we've built out one suburb, with streets in it, built the main boulevard in and out of the estate. And then we have several other streets and roads which we're still working on. They're usable, but they are not yet paved, so we're working on paving those and building out another about 15 kilometers of streets or so between next year and this year. So it's been a lot of like road building. We are extending grid throughout these phases that we've opened up. So taking power to the various lots of land that have been made available. Water and sanitation, same thing as well. So a lot of like traditional infra that we're building. So there's been a lot of that. Outside of that, in terms of like other plans we have, so we also intend to get started building a physical school. So the Explorer School has a physical presence as well as an online presence. We build a restaurant in the park, which we typically just use at the moment for so like activities as and when we have them. So we haven't turned it into a full-time experience just yet. Yeah, so that's what we're working on at the moment, and that's what our immediate plans are. We also have in our master plan allocation for things like the shopping centers and the hotel, and among other things. Excuse me. And our intention is to also roll those out, but that also requires that a larger population be resident at the city first. So we'll probably start off with more traditional high street style shopping in the neighborhoods that folks would have houses built in, and then build out the larger shopping experiences later on.
That's awesome. I admire the ambition. It's a huge endeavor, and you're just kind of taking it full steam ahead, but at the same time going slowly enough to hopefully put some of the right pieces in place in the right order and not have to do too much, resetting and rebuilding along the way. We'll be curious to learn more about how you're financing the whole thing. So there's Frontier Capital Partners, where you're a co-founder, like I mentioned earlier, Thebe Investments, and then you sold, it sounded like, 80 initial plots of land. I think these are the ones that you did on kind of a 5-year payment plan to help finance some of the initial building of Nkwashi. Could you just talk about how some of the capital is coming in to build this vision out over time?
Yeah, so the first tranche of capital was formed by subdividing 85-acre plots and then selling those in 5-year plans. And so that created initial liquidity to master plan the concept and engage in the initial marketing thereof. And then what we've done is we've been selling residential lots in phases. And again, on payment plans that enable capital to be released each month, that is then used to build out the infra. So that enables us basically to sort of like cover the capital cost of building out each phase that we are marketing to the public. And so like take this programmatic approach to achieving the master plan. So you know that each year these are the milestones that we need to achieve, and then you are able to then harvest cash flows from sales of land to finance those activities. More recently, as of last week, we launched a new way of enabling homeownership in Nkwashi. And basically, instead of selling absolute ownership of the land, what we're now doing is providing long-term leases on the land. So we're basically acting a lot more like a traditional municipality, where we are making available sections of the town to the general public, and then people subscribe to various plots of land, and they gain the right to occupancy, right? So they can actually sell their plot to other people. Should they elect to do so, they can build on it, and so the improvements are wholly theirs. And the business model for us is that we then charge a ground rent, which we are calling a rate, which is effectively like a property tax of sorts, that enables us to then service that neighborhood. So initially that's infrastructure, but then much more long-term, that also includes things like garbage collection, maintenance of roads and street lighting, and then management of the parks and all these various communal spaces and services that a city typically would provide to its residents. And so in a sense, what we're actually now doing is sort of like enabling residency, as opposed to like selling land in the traditional sense. And we found that that's been very, very warmly accepted by the local community. So our wait list is now something like 3,500 people, and that's been achieved in about a week. So should that velocity continue, I think we'll be growing that backlog of people who want to participate in this pretty rapidly.
Yeah, it's funny. In preparing for this conversation, I took note of the fact that you guys had, I think at the time that I saw, 2,000 people on the wait list. So it's almost doubled since then. And I think that was maybe a tweet from just a few days ago even. So it's cool to see the success and the warm reception that the new model has had thus far. I understand you're involved closely with Mark Lutter from Charter Cities Institute. Had him on the podcast previously as well, and spoke a bit about Nkwashi in that conversation. How has Mark been instrumental in helping you think about some of these things as well?
Yeah, Mark's been great in helping us think about these things, because I think he brought a new perspective, right? So initially, when we first started working on this project, we thought about it very much as a master plan community that is a functional satellite city. We didn't really think about ourselves being a long-term developer of cities, and we didn't really think a lot about the governance of these cities within the context of ensuring we could build out systems that would optimize for economic growth and stuff like that. So I think Mark's really helped inform our thinking, and I guess also helped us be a little bit more ambitious. And so, in that respect, has been great. He's also been really helpful with engaging with the local government authorities here in Zambia and trying to encourage them to update their special economic zone policies and legislation so that they can allow for something that will be much more similar in keeping with the charter city concept. So that's been great. He's also been helpful in introducing us to loads of people who are enthusiastic about the space from around the world.
So is that something where you expect, you mentioned the working with the government to work on new definitions of special economic zones and things like that. One of the core tenets of charter cities is to be able to experiment with new forms of governance and new bylaws in a way. Is this something that you expect for Nkwashi and some of the other cities that can be built in the future to be able to experiment with the government a little bit?
Yeah, that's the intention. So, our thinking is that the existing policies, whilst okay, don't really provide enough of a catalyst to actually attract foreign capital into these new cities, right? And so these enhancements that Mark's promoting would help achieve that. And also they'll be very general in the sense that anyone who applies for this credential could, provided they meet certain criteria, achieve them, right? And so it's good for the rest of the country, but it could also be great for Nkwashi. And our intention is once this is done, that would certainly be pursuing that.
So last question. You're very transparent across all of the companies and organizations that you've built and their online presence. You talk a lot about your values and the master plan. I think you list a number of principles. Two of those principles caught my attention, and would just love to hear how they kind of impact the way that you approach your day to day. So the two that I took notice of was one, you talk about the importance of effort leverage, and the other you said you don't need a steak in a single bite. How do these kind of principles drive the core of who you are and how you attack your everyday?
So I think about those things quite a bit. So with respect to like not eating a steak in a single bite, that speaks to something I've sort of reiterated a couple times in this conversation, which is slow and steady is probably better than really rapid and disruptive, but destructive also. So there's a lot of learning that's involved in getting stuff like this done, and being presumptuous generally isn't a great idea. So like being deliberate and speaking to loads of people, learning, understanding, and then acting, I think is something that's of value. But also, the vision is big, the mission is big, the costs are really high, the risks are also really high. And so taking these very big ideas, concepts, and things, and so like breaking them down into smaller milestones or activities helps us grapple with them, right? So we can sort of like deal with the smaller things, and then sort of like as you add these smaller steps together, it becomes larger leaps and a lot of progress. So that just really helps us execute. And then with respect to like effort leverage, I think that's more of a function of time management. So there's a bunch of things that we could potentially be doing, spending our time on. But to the extent that they only provide very marginal contribution towards achieving the broader vision, then it's like the opportunity cost of pursuing those things is really high. So we would rather focus our time, resources, and abilities on those things which are, number one, really fundamentally at the core of enabling us to achieve our vision and our mission. And number two are big enablers of those little steps that we mentioned, right? So to the extent that something might not necessarily have big uplift in and of itself, but enables us to achieve more important smaller steps, then it's worth pursuing because those smaller steps are fundamental. So that's generally how I think about things.
I think that's a great perspective and principles that I certainly, maybe with a little bit different wording, consider very strongly myself. I think they're great ways to approach your day to day, especially with a mission as large as the one that you're on. So I want to wrap up there. Mwiya, I really appreciate you taking the time today. It was awesome hearing your perspective on all of this and what you're building, from Nkwashi to Taji more broadly, and your general master plan to advance African civilization. Before we close out, I want to give you the ability to kind of share anything that you might not have gotten to in our conversation today, and tell people where they can learn more about you and follow the progress of all this online. But thanks again for making the time and sharing this perspective. And I really look forward to following your mission in the years to come.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, and it's been a great chat. So with regards to anything else, one of the things I've found is building out a great team is definitely like a difficult thing to do in general, regardless of where you are in the world. But here, I think that also tends to be even truer, largely because this is a little bit of an esoteric niche that we're involved in. And so if there's anybody out there in the world that's, keen to get involved, either on the blockchain stuff or on the city building proper or on the education side, I'd be keen to hear from you. I'm reachable on Twitter. My handle is Mwiyas, so that's Mwiyas. So yeah, I'm pretty responsive there. Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Jake.